The Talmud is Jewish law. It is Jewish jurisprudence, or you could say the corpus juris of Jewish law. Now, why Jewish law? The reason is that for most of history, and we could say from the beginning of history, until the 19th century, until the modern period, Jewish communities were governed by Jewish law. And they were governed by Jewish law because this was the preferred method of ruling by many emperors. The Persian emperors, who gave freedom of religion to all of their subjects, they expected each religious community to govern itself internally. And so the Jews were governed by Jewish law. Babylonians were governed by Babylonian law, and that was accepted. Later on, it was continued. When the Persian Empire was defeated by Alexander the Great, and the Jews came under the control of Greek governments, they still lived by Jewish law, and the Jewish legal system governed all aspects of Jewish life. Still later, with the rise of the Roman Empire, that continued. And then, with the rise of Christianity, we had not only the continuity of a Jewish self-government or autonomy, but there was also the hostility of the Roman Empire, which was Christian. That is, after the Roman Empire became Christian under the Emperor Constantine. And this begins in the year 325. The Jewish communities were still self-governing, but then there was a new relationship between the government and the Jewish community. The Babylonian Talmud was the Talmud that was the system of Jewish law that governed the Jewish community in Babylonia and Iran and Arabia, that being the Persian Empire. In the Persian Empire, the Jews had very extensive autonomy and freedom on a very large scale. At the same time, in the Roman Empire, the Jews had autonomy and freedom until the rise of the church, after which there is a certain restriction imposed upon the Jews by the church, and now we'll see the differences between them. Okay, now let's get back to the basics. When I say that the Talmud is Jewish law, what is Jewish law? Jewish law is the legal system that is in the Bible. In the first 5 books of the Bible, let's say that's the Constitution. The basic constitution of Jewish law is the Torah. We live in a society which has a basic constitution, the United States. And we say we live according to the Constitution of the United States. But do we? There is a Constitution of the United States. You can print it on 2 pages. To understand the meaning of the Constitution, you have to study all the decisions of the Supreme Court from 1789 to 2002. In other words, if there's a certain case, and you're a constitutional lawyer, and you want to fight that case, you're going to research the decisions affecting that particular case as they were decided over the course of the centuries. And of course, there are differences of opinion. I mean, just the case of prayer in the public schools, which was fought bitterly. In 1962, they made a decision that prayer should be forbidden in the public schools. Well, if you read, that decision was not unanimous. It was 6-3. And if you read the opinions of Rehnquist and 2 other justices, especially of Rehnquist, he will show you, according to his understanding of it, that that's not what the First Amendment meant. It didn't mean there has to be a complete separation of church and state. It simply means, the way it reads, there shall not be an established church in the United States. But we also see how law works. You have divisions of opinion, you have arguments, and they are resolved in a certain way. Now let's get back to Jewish law. When you say the Jewish law is the law that's in the Bible, that's the Torah law. So we live according to it. But even when we do, we come up against statements and questions. Well, what does it mean? You have a case, you wonder, someone said the law's on my side, and you argue, and you have to resolve that somehow. And the decision has to be made, and the decision goes either one way or another way. Now, over the course of many centuries, the Jews, and by the way, we're talking about the Jewish world. You know what the Jewish world was, let's say, around 2,000 years ago? 2,000 years ago, there were Jewish communities in India, Afghanistan, Persia, Babylonia, Syria, Palestine, Egypt, North Africa, Italy, France, Germany, Spain, Portugal, England. Now, in any community that lives for any period of time, over the course of time, and they live by a legal system, that legal system is going to expand. It's going to exfoliate. I mean, the decisions will be made, and the meaning of the law will be explained and argued by the courts and decisions made by the judges of these courts. Now, up to the year 200, the center of Jewish legal authority was in the land of Israel. It was in a court called the Sanhedrin. Sanhedrin is a Greek word which was adopted by the Jews to indicate to the Greeks and the Romans, we have a legal system which you call Sanhedrin in Greek, and we'll call it Sanhedrin in Hebrew because it means the same thing. It means a legal system. The Jews had a legal system which was centered in the land of Israel, but its authority extended over the whole Jewish world. So the Jews of Babylonia or of Persia and the Jews of Rome and of Europe, they all essentially would take their final decisions, what we would call a constitutional problem that had to be settled by a Supreme Court. The Sanhedrin in the land of Israel would make these decisions for all Jewish communities. As these things continued, the Jews began to suffer certain problems, very serious problems, especially in the Roman Empire. First, you had the war against the rebels in Judea, and that was a war which lasted from 66 to 73. In the year 70, Jerusalem was conquered by the Romans. The temple was destroyed. That was a terrible disaster. But it was a war of the Roman Empire against the rebels in Judea. It was not a war against the Jews. The Jews of the rest of the Roman Empire did not suffer. Only the Jews of the land of Israel did, because it was a war that took place in the land of Israel. But as a result of that, the destruction of the temple, the Jewish authorities said, we have to do something to reconstitute at least our legal system. Now, there's no temple, so we don't have to deal with sacrifices or priests doing their things, but we still have to deal with everything else in Jewish life. So let's organize our system. And they began to organize a system of what? Of recording decisions made by the courts of the Jews over the course of time and putting them into categories or into sections. Now, when I say that the Jewish authority was in the land of Israel, but judges on the Supreme Court, on the Sanhedrin, could be from any place. Any Jew who was a lawyer and was a competent lawyer and came to argue a case, after a while they'd recognize this and say, this man is pretty bright. You should keep our eye on him. And that's why when a judge on the Supreme Court died, they would fill his place with somebody whom they would choose from among the leading lights of Jewish law. So you had Jews from Babylon or Persia or any other part of the Jewish world who could sit on the Supreme Court because it was a united legal system. But then more troubles began, and that was in the days of the Emperor Hadrian, and something else had happened. After the year 100 of the Christian era, the Christian community had grown. And now the Christians were Romans and Greeks primarily, and later Egyptians and Syrians. But there were no Jewish Christians anymore. The Jewish Christians who were the associates of Jesus and who lived in his time, they probably were killed in the rebellion of the year 70 when Jerusalem was destroyed, because they were all Jerusalemites. But after that, the preachings of St. Paul, the preachings of St. Matthew and others, they converted many of the pagans to Christianity. And so you have Romans and Greeks who are Christians, and they have developed a theological idea which had some anti-Jewish elements in it. I will explain them. The Christians of the 2nd century began to write hostile documents against the Jews. And one of their greatest complaints was that theologically, the destruction of the temple was not just a war between the Romans and the Jews. The destruction of the temple was God's will. God wanted the temple to be destroyed to symbolize the death of Judaism and Christianity replacing Judaism. That to them was symbolic, because Christianity adopted a theology which we call supersession. Christianity now replaces Judaism in the eyes of God. This, of course, put Judaism at a very great disadvantage as the Roman population was becoming more Christian. And so, when the Jews petitioned the Emperor Trajan for permission to rebuild the temple, and they thought this would be done because, after all, when the temple was destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BC, and then the Persian Emperor Cyrus conquered the Babylonian Empire, Cyrus the Great said the temple in Jerusalem should be rebuilt. And that's a very interesting document that's in the Bible, in the book of Ezra, chapter 1. Cyrus declares the temple in Jerusalem must be rebuilt, and the Jews should rebuild the land of Israel. So the Jews said, okay, the temple was destroyed, terrible thing. Now they went to the Roman emperor and they asked for permission to rebuild the temple. Well, the Emperor Trajan was busy with many things, as every emperor is. And the Trajan column in Rome, by the way, describes all of his campaigns and the wars that he led. It's a brilliant marble column, which is being dissolved by the polluted rain. The Emperor Trajan was busy, and somehow he didn't grant the Jews' request. And then the Emperor Hadrian followed him, and the Jews began to petition the Emperor Hadrian for permission to rebuild the temple. And at first he said, well, sure, I mean, the pagan emperors knew a religion needs a temple. Jews are a recognized religion. They had a temple, they should rebuild it. But then he began to get all kinds of letters and propaganda and speeches by Christians saying Jews should not rebuild the temple because the Christians were against that. The rebuilding of the temple was the one thing that they feared and dreaded. And, you know, to Hadrian, a Roman emperor who has obligations from England, you know, there's a wall in northern England near Scotland called Hadrian's Wall. That was the extent of the Roman Empire in the north. And war against the Persians. He's got all of these things. And here, as far as he was concerned, these Jews say build the temple. These Jews say don't build the temple. If you think a Roman in the year 120 knew the difference between Jews and Christians, you're making a mistake. I mean, when you read a book like Suetonius and he talks about the Jews making riots in Rome and led by this rabble-rouser whose name is Christus, you see, Suetonius didn't know that Christ, or Christos to the Greek language, meant the Messiah to the Christians. He thought the Jews are fighting over something and making riots, and they're being led by this guy Christus. I mean, and Hadrian may not have been able to distinguish, but nevertheless, to him this was a problem. And rather than saying, okay, I will let the Jews rebuild the temple, and these are saying no, he's saying, you know, I have too many things on my plate. Forget it. No. And eventually he became anti the temple. He started out saying okay, and then he said no. And when he became against that, and the Christians persisted in their anti-Jewish propaganda, he turned anti-Jewish. And he began to pass laws and decrees not only against the temple, he began to pass laws against Judaism and the practice of Judaism. That's when the great crisis emerged, and Rabbi Akiva, who participated in the second revolt against Rome, and actually appointed Bar Kokhba to be the military leader, the Jews broke out in rebellion against Rome in the year 132, and they fought brilliantly. But, you know, Hadrian was the emperor of the Roman Empire, so he began to gather the troops from all over, from Europe and from England and from the East, and he brought them into the land of Israel and began a process of destruction of the country. And, of course, after 3 years, the Bar Kokhba rebellion was crushed and all of its leaders were killed. Rabbi Akiva was the one who said, we've got to get Jewish law written down and classified. And he started the process which led to the Mishnah. What is the Mishnah? The Mishnah is a codification of Jewish law, that it's the code of Jewish law. If you ask what is the constitution of Jewish law, you could say, well, theoretically it's the Holy Torah given by God to Moses. But practically, the constitution of the Jewish law is the Mishnah. Akiva started the process sometime around the year 120. But around the year 130, he knew there was a terrible crisis, so he urged them to get together and begin to gather and classify Jewish law. In the year 135, he was captured by the Romans, and he was tortured to death. But the process had begun, and he was succeeded by Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir continued to gather the material for the compilation of this code of Jewish law. What was the material they gathered? Decisions of the courts. Decisions of the courts in Babylonia, decisions of the courts in Israel, decisions of the Supreme Court who were in the land of Israel. All of these decisions were taken, they were classified and categorized and put into shape for a code. This was a period when the Romans were hostile to the Jews and they were in trouble. I mean, Akiva was killed by the Romans. Rabbi Meir escaped, but the Romans had posters all over. Rabbi Meir, dead or alive, capture this guy, you know. And while this was going on, he was working and compiling the Jewish legal system. Finally, two emperors came to power in Rome who were very benevolent to the Jews and very kind and became friendly to them. One of them was Antoninus Pius, and the other was Marcus Aurelius. And Marcus Aurelius was the emperor of Rome, and he was a philosopher. He wrote 3 books on philosophy. You read his philosophy, boy, this guy's a modern philosopher. He was a humanist, a very interesting thinker. Marcus Aurelius was friendly to the Jews, and Antoninus Pius was very friendly to the Jews. This made it possible for Rabbi Yehuda, Hanasi we call him, that means the president, or usually said the patriarch. Now what does that mean? The Nasi, he was Chief Justice of the Sanhedrin. Rabbi Judah edited the final edition of the Mishnah. The Mishnah is the code of Jewish law, and it was done in the year 200 under the editorship of Rabbi Judah the Patriarch. Now, how was it organized? It was organized as follows. The Mishnah was organized into 6 categories, and they are agriculture, festivals, domestic relations, civil and criminal, temple, priesthood, and hygiene. Why these major categories? Well, you have to make a decision and say, in effect, we have to put the laws into certain order. And so this was the order they chose. The first would be agriculture, pertains to the land, it's very basic. The second, they decided festivals, the Sabbath, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Passover, Shavuot, Sukkot, Purim. All of this is a part of the way of life of the Jewish people. Domestic relations, of course, important. Domestic relations, laws pertaining to marriage, ketubah, that's very interesting. I'll explain what ketubot are. If you have marriage, you have to have divorce. So marriage, divorce, domestic relations, and then other things pertaining to husband and wife, all of this are incorporated in domestic relations. Ketubah, by the way, is the prenuptial agreement, which is essential in Jewish life. You have to make a prenuptial agreement. Don't leave things until it's too late. So Jewish law requires that you have an agreement made before the marriage, which is written into this document called the ketubah. Basically, it provides, in its simplest form, the husband guarantees the wife a sum of money in case of divorce or in case of his death. And that's the ketubah, required in all Jewish marriages. Now, criminal and civil, you know what that is, civil and criminal law. And it's so interesting because it deals with real estate, labor relations, labor contracts, contracts on money, things having to do with banking. All civil things that you could think of are dealt with, and there are criminal laws too, which are dealt with in that section. Number 5, temple and priesthood. After all, there was a temple. There are laws pertaining to the temple. These are part of it as well. And then you have a 6th section called hygiene, which I translate as hygiene, because there are many laws in the Torah that pertain to what they call cleanliness and uncleanliness. And if you do something, you become unclean, and then you have to bathe, and then you become clean in the evening, something like that. One of the important things, if you touch the body of a dead person, you become unclean for 7 days. That's a major uncleanliness. And then you have to go through a cleansing process. So there are many laws pertaining to hygiene. But one of the basic principles in hygiene also has to do with menstruation and postpartum treatment. In other words, women giving birth and all of these things has to do with. The basic problem in hygiene in Jewish law is if you're bleeding for any reason, except for a wound, let's say, then there's a cleansing process which has to take place. So all of this is incorporated into these. By the way, every one of these sections is subdivided into separate sections. So let's say in the case of agriculture, there are about 12 sections because they have to do with all the laws in the Bible which deal with harvest and trees and so on. By the way, there's a Jewish law. If you plant a tree, a fruit tree, first 3 years you're not allowed to eat its fruit. Only in the 4th year are you allowed to eat its fruit. There are many things, and there may be something scientific behind it. We don't know. The point is that's the law. Then there are laws pertaining to what kind of plants you're allowed to put together. You're not allowed to put 2 different plants in the same planting, let's say. You have to separate them by rows. There are a lot of other things which have to do with agriculture and so on. Now, festivals, domestic relations. Domestic relations has 7 subdivisions. Festivals has about 10 subdivisions, civil and criminal law, many subdivisions, and so on. That's the basic law, and it's called the Mishnah, and it was put in its final form in the year 200. Tell you something fascinating about the Mishnah. In the Mishnah, we have a very interesting thing which they decided, and Rabbi Yehuda put it in. When the Mishnah lists a law, if it is a law which was decided by the Sanhedrin without dissent, they just say that's the law. If it was a law where you had a difference of opinion and you had a majority decision, and that's what makes the law, majority decision, and you have a dissenting opinion, they always listed the name of the dissenting opinions. In other words, they could say, the majority said, this is okay. There was a minority opinion which differed, and then you put down the name of the judge who gave the minority opinion. So interesting. Why was that thought of? Because the theory is, we made a decision. We think this is right. The majority said it's right. But do we know what's the ultimate truth? Only God knows that. But at some future date, for some reason, if there is a feeling that this decision should be reversed, at least we have the name of a judge who gave a dissenting opinion, and let's start with his dissent and try to argue the case again. And that's why they always put in the names of the dissenting opinions. The Torah says, on 3 occasions, you shall not cook a kid in its mother's milk. Very interesting statement. You shall not cook a kid in its mother's milk. What does it mean? It means don't cook young goat in its mother's milk. That's what it says. But the rabbis said it means more than that. It means you shouldn't cook meat and milk together. And then they said further, you shouldn't eat meat and milk together. And you know, there's a famous joke. God said, you shall not cook a kid in its mother's milk. So Moses says, does that mean we can't cook any other kind of meat in milk? So God says, I said, you shall not cook a kid in its mother's milk. So Moses says, does that mean we can't eat meat and milk together? God says, I said, you shall not cook a kid in its mother's milk. So Moses says, does that mean we have to have separate dishes for milk and meat? God says, you know, Moses, do it your way. But you know, the rabbis said, why is it written 3 times? So they said it means you're not allowed to cook meat and milk, you're not allowed to eat meat and milk together, and you're not allowed to keep them together. So the Talmud says, all meat is forbidden, all meat is forbidden to be cooked in milk. And you're not allowed to put meat and milk together on the same table when you're eating. Along comes Rabbi Yossi of Galilee, and he says, we in Galilee, we eat chicken a la king, chicken and cream. Why? Hey, it says thou shalt not cook a kid in its mother's milk. Do you know a chicken that gives milk? Birds don't give milk, so why shouldn't we have chicken in milk? So they said, well, that's your opinion, and we'll record it, but the majority say no, for various reasons. The point is that there are differences of opinion, and they are recorded. Now, in addition to that, there was another collection done at the same time, and it's called the Tosefta. And it's just like the Mishnah and follows the same pattern, but there are some laws in the Tosefta which are different. And so, the question is, well, what's the Tosefta doing there? So we have the Mishnah and the Tosefta. And the word Tosefta simply means addenda. What's that? Well, what they said was, you know, there are many differences of opinion, and there are many laws, and they have different decisions. So let's put them together in this thing called the Tosefta, which is the same size as the Mishnah, follows the same pattern, and it's simply another source in case you want to argue again. What it shows is a kind of liberal approach, namely, we're going to let as many opinions as possible be expressed, and we can always appeal to them if we feel that there's a need to re-argue the case and make a different decision. So that is the basic constitution of Jewish law. It's the Mishnah with the Tosefta as reference and with other references which appear, which I'll discuss. Now we get to the Gemara. Mishnah is now a constitution. It's the law of the Jews. What happens to a constitution when it's in a living community? It's argued. Remember, we have a constitution, we have cases, we have decisions that are made, and we're still coming to court, and we're still arguing, and we're still trying to overturn decisions. So we have a continuity of Jewish law. Now we come to the critical problem. Why are there two Talmuds, Jerusalem and Babylonian? Around the year 200, the Jews of the land of Israel were now living under a growing Christian Roman civilization, and they were beginning to feel the hostility. The Jews of Babylon felt absolutely free, and they felt that they didn't want to suffer under the constraints which let's simply call it the intellectual, emotional atmosphere of the Roman Empire after the year 200 was developing an anti-Jewish attitude. The Jews of Babylon said, why should we have to deal with this? The Babylonian Jewish community is big and it's flourishing and it's progressive, and the Jewish community of Babylonia doesn't have any of these restrictions. Now that we have the Mishnah in written form, and we've copied it, and many copies of the Mishnah were made, why don't we take the Mishnah, establish our own courts in Babylonia, and deal with Jewish law on the basis of the Mishnah as the Constitution, and we'll deal with Jewish law. We won't have to refer back to the Sanhedrin in Israel all the time. Now, once again, the Jews of Babylonia say, why can't we take the Mishnah? It's now the Constitution of the Jews. We'll go back to Babylonia. We'll establish our supreme courts there. We don't have to refer back to the Sanhedrin of Israel all the time. Well, this was the cause of a conflict, very serious conflict. Rabbi Yehuda, who was the editor of the Mishnah, he was very unhappy with this decision. Why? Because several of the most prominent judges on the Sanhedrin in Israel were Babylonian Jews who said, we're going back to Babylonia and we'll establish our own supreme courts there. He didn't like that, but he couldn't stop it. And so several Babylonian Jews, one was called Rav, the other was called Samuel, they went back to Babylonia and established supreme courts there. Now, out of respect, they didn't call their Supreme Court a Sanhedrin. They didn't even organize it on the same fashion. The Sanhedrin in Israel had 71 judges. They simply had a group which they called together, and they called it Kala, which means the assembly, which was parallel to the Sanhedrin in Israel, and they made decisions on Jewish law in Babylonia. At the same time, the Sanhedrin in Israel continued to develop Jewish law in Israel. Now, on top of the Mishnah, we have something called the Gemara. Mishnah plus Gemara is Talmud. Now, what does that mean? The word Gemara, again, you know, these words are so interesting. Mishnah means study. Gemara means study. Talmud means study. Torah means study. These are variants on the same concept, namely, we're always studying the law, we're always trying to interpret the law. Gemara is an Aramaic word, which means study, and the Gemara is the record of arguments and court decisions made on the basis of the Mishnah, which is the Constitution. Once again, Gemara is the record of the arguments and decisions made on Jewish law on the basis of the Mishnah as the Constitution. So the Gemara is a continuity of Jewish law. It's simply an expansion of the development of Jewish law after the year 200, just as you would have in any legal system. So there is a Gemara which was created by the Jews in Babylonia based on the Mishnah, and that Gemara plus the Mishnah is the Babylonian Talmud. The Jews of the land of Israel and the Supreme Court, the Sanhedrin in Israel, They have a Gemara based on the same Mishnah, which became the Jerusalem Talmud. So there are two Talmuds, the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud. The differences between them are very serious, very significant. The Jerusalem Talmud was the decisions of the Supreme Court of the Jews in the land of Israel and of the whole Roman Empire, because the Sanhedrin of the Jews in the land of Israel was the law code of the Jews of the Roman Empire. So it went from Israel all the way west into the Roman Empire. The Babylonian Talmud was created by the Jews of Babylonia, and that affected the Jews of Babylonia and Persia and India and Arabia and Syria. So you had two different Talmuds developing. They're both Jewish law, they're both developments of Jewish law, but because of the differences of conditions and the political differences, you have differences in the development. Now I'll explain some of them. In the Jerusalem Talmud, there's a very interesting problem. First of all, in the Jerusalem Talmud, the agricultural laws are fully developed because they apply to the land of Israel, and they were living in the land of Israel. Section number 5 of the Mishnah doesn't exist in the Jerusalem Talmud. Why? Because it deals with the temple. And the Jerusalem Talmud was being created by a Sanhedrin, a Jewish law court, in an empire that was now dominated by the Christian church. And the Christian censors were sitting in the courtroom. And they said, don't discuss anything pertaining to the temple. There will never be a temple. Don't even talk about it. There is no section on the temple in the Jerusalem Talmud because the Christian censors were on them. The other thing about the Jerusalem Talmud is it tends to have a kind of, you could say, a restrictive form of expression. It's as if they were always looking over their shoulders at the Christian censors and developed a mode of speech which kind of was code, you might say, as if to hide certain things because the censors would come down on them immediately. So we have this restraint in the Jerusalem Talmud. But it was the law code of the Jews of the Roman Empire and the Jews of the land of Israel. Now, the Jerusalem Talmud was sealed that it was ended in 425. When we read the Roman Constitution of that period, we realize that the church was constantly harping on the emperor and saying, restrict the Jews, and finally, he decreed in 425 that the Sanhedrin should be abolished. And so the Sanhedrin was abolished in 425, and from that time on, Jewish communities throughout the Roman Empire governed themselves by Jewish law locally. I mean, they would occasionally appeal to some authority in a central city, let's say like Rome or Alexandria, Egypt, or even Jerusalem, but they were self-governing because the Sanhedrin was abolished. And then they recorded their decisions and they recorded their judgments, the Mishnah plus the Gemara, and that became the Jerusalem Talmud. Now, when we get to the Babylonian Talmud, totally different atmosphere. The Babylonian Jews felt completely free. They felt unrestricted and unrestrained. They said whatever they wanted, expressed whatever they wanted, and they wrote several volumes, many volumes, on the temple and the priesthood and everything going on in the temple. Now, here's an interesting question. If the temple didn't exist, what are you talking about? Why are you talking about everything that's supposed to go on there? Not only Pesach and the festivals and Sukkot and the ritual and the priesthood and everything else. Why? The answer is interesting. The Jews never gave up hope that the temple would be restored. In other words, in their prayers, and Jews to this day pray, we pray for the day when the temple will be restored. And if the Jews believe that the temple will be restored, they're not going to stop talking about it. So they studied it in great detail. The Jews never gave up hope that the temple would be rebuilt, and so they studied it. Now, in the Babylonian Talmud, there's no restraint. They talk about everything and anything. Therefore, the Babylonian Talmud has, in addition to all its discussions on law, it also has a lot of side anecdotes and stories and midrashim, that is, interpretations of biblical ideas. And they speak freely about anything and everything that you could imagine. And their language is unrestrained. sometimes relevant to a legal discussion, and sometimes just because something occurred to them and they decide to tell the story. It's very interesting, but it's written in the language which was not well known to Jews outside of that area. The language of the Talmud, by the way, of the language of both Talmuds, the Mishnah is written in Hebrew, which is the language of the Bible. The Gemara, the commentary on the Mishnah, is written in Aramaic. Why? Because the language, Aramaic language, was generally, that was the language spoken in the entire Middle East for over 1,000 years, even more, for about 1,200 years. From Persia to the Mediterranean Sea, all the lands between 500 BC and 600 of the Christian era, all the lands spoke Aramaic. Aramaic was the language of Babylonia, which is Iraq and Syria and Palestine, parts of Egypt and parts of Persia. And because it was the language of the whole area, it developed in different dialects, as any widespread language would. So we have Eastern Aramaic, Western Aramaic, we have Christian Aramaic and Jewish Aramaic. So this is the interesting thing about the language of the Talmud. It's two different dialects. The Jerusalem Talmud is written in the Jewish Aramaic of the West, and because it's in the Roman Empire, it has a lot of Greek and Latin words in it added. This happens whenever two languages are in contact with each other. The Babylonian Talmud is written in Jewish Aramaic of the East and has in it, in addition to Greek and Latin words, it has Persian and Babylonian words. So you have these two languages, and they are the languages of the Talmud. What is the law that Jews all over the world lived by, let's say, since the year 800, 900? Since the year 900, the entire Jewish world was governed by the laws of the Babylonian Talmud. The Babylonian Talmud is universal. It's not restrained or restricted. It is not restricted to Jewish life in the land of Israel because they lived outside the land of Israel. And so the laws of the Babylonian Talmud tend to be very universal and liberal and applicable to any situation. The laws of the Jerusalem Talmud seem to be concentrated on the land of Israel and were also restricted by this Christian censorship. At a certain point, and this is interesting, where Jewish-Christian interests intersect, when Charlemagne became the emperor of Western Europe in the year 800, Charlemagne was crowned king of the Holy Roman Empire by Pope Leo III in the year 800. He became emperor of Western Europe, and Western Europe in the year 800 had suffered a lot of invasions of barbarians and wild tribes from northern Europe. When Charlemagne became emperor, he had two problems on his hands. One was to raise the cultural level of Europe and to increase the economy of Europe. To raise the cultural level, he had to invite learned priests from England, where there were learned priests. Alcuin of York was the one who came and started to raise the cultural level of Christian Europe in Germany and in Western Europe. But then Charlemagne said, we need people to raise the economy. And the wealthiest empire in the world in the year 800 was the Islamic Empire of Baghdad, based in Babylonia, that is, Iraq. So Charlemagne said, you know, if we could get Jews from Babylonia to come to Europe, they'll be able to do things for us and bring the economy and make international trade. I mean, he really had this vision. If he could only get Jews from Babylonia to come to Europe, it would raise the economic level of the empire. So he sent ambassadors to Babylonia, and they spoke to the Jews, and they convinced them that they should send some of their learned men to Europe. And so two schools were established in Europe, that is, two groups of learned Jews. One was Rabbi Moshe of Babylonia, the other was Rabbi Kalonymus. They came to Europe, and he gave them schools and buildings and whatever they needed in Rome, and another one in Narbonne in southern France, and they began to establish and raise the level of Jewish learning, but they brought the Babylonian Talmud with them. And they brought the Babylonian Talmud to Europe, and the Jews began to realize Babylonian Talmud is more flexible, it's more liberal, and gradually The whole Jewish world began to live according to the laws of the Babylonian Talmud, and the Jerusalem Talmud was left for reference. And the Babylonian Talmud became Jewish law down to the 19th century, and Jews lived by it. Now, I want to just tell a few interesting features of how Jews live by Jewish law and adjust to modern times in many cases. There was a famous rabbi in New York. There were some famous rabbis. One was Moshe Feinstein. Moshe Feinstein was in Manhattan, Lower East Side, and he was one of the great scholars, one of the greatest scholars of Jewish law. He was also the person to whom they would appeal from all over the world for decisions. And he was not afraid to give decisions. Moshe Feinstein was not afraid, and he had courage. I'll tell you a couple of cases. Talk about modern life and Jewish law. A case came up, artificial insemination. That's modern. How are you going to deal with it from the Talmud? Well, he studied the Talmud, and he studied it very well. But he said in certain conditions where there's some kind of medical problem that prevents a husband and wife from conceiving, you can permit the transfer of semen to the egg through some artificial method. And they said it's okay. He gives a decision. Don't you think he was attacked by other moral? Of course he was attacked, but he held his ground. He was not afraid. They made the decision. It's okay under certain conditions. Another interesting case came up. A couple gave birth to Siamese twins, and it was a very serious case. The physician said, this is a case where the two cannot survive if they leave them alone. There's one heart or a vital organ. If we leave them alone, they'll both die. If we do the surgery and let one of the children have the vital organs, that child will survive, the other one will die. What can we do? It so happened that these people appealed to Rabbi Moshe Feinstein for a decision. So he said, there is a story in the Talmud which says, if two people are in the desert and there's one canteen of water between them, if they divide the water equally, they'll both die. But if one of them drinks the water, he will survive and the other one will die. And there's a debate in the Talmud. And one of them says they should divide the water equal and we both die. And Rabbi Akiva says, no, one must survive. It's because he says there's a sentence from the Bible, he says, one must survive. Rabbi Feinstein said the operation should be done, save one of the Siamese twins, even though the other one will die. It's based on Talmud. It's interesting. I'm going to tell one more story, which is interesting from another point of view, and should be very interesting to American Jews. In a way, it's a funny story. The island of Crete is in Greece. It's in the southern part of the Aegean Sea. On the island of Crete, there was a city by the name of Candia. And Candia had a Jewish population, which was there from the days of, Alexander the Great. So Candia had a Greek-speaking Jewish population. There were several Greek-speaking Jewish populations scattered around the Aegean Sea. Then, at a certain point, there was a migration of Italian Jews from certain Italian states. Italy had about 30 independent states. Some of them were very friendly to the Jews. Some of them, the Pope suppressed them. So Jews fled from Italy, and they came to Candia. So now there were Italian-speaking Jews and Greek-speaking Jews living together. And they decided that they're going to make an organization of rabbis to guide the whole community. Then there came a migration of Jews from Germany. So now you had three languages there. Yiddish, the German Jews were speaking Yiddish, Italian, and Greek. And then came 1492, and the Spanish expelled all the Jews from Spain, and now you had a flood of Spanish Jews coming in. And now you have in the city of Candia, a lot of cities in the Turkish Empire, but in the city of Candia you had Spanish-speaking Jews and German, Yiddish, and Italian, and Greek, and they're all together. And the rabbi said, well, let's make a council of the rabbis, and let's appoint a police department to enforce our decisions. And it worked that way for quite a long time. And every time they made a decision, and by the way, when you read these accounts of the rabbinical decisions of Candia, you see that community in the year 1500 and 1550 had the same problems as any Jewish community. People who are cheating, people who are committing things that are not so nice and all that. They made decisions, And they enforced them, and they had a police force. Now, whenever they signed their names, and you can tell from the names that they're Greeks or Italians or Germans or Spaniards. It's interesting that most of the Italian rabbis were also physicians. So after their name, they'd write MD, or in Hebrew, Rofei. Now, there was a tradition in the synagogues in Kandia. And the tradition was that on Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement, in the afternoon, when they read the Torah and they read the prophets, we read the prophet Jonah, because the book of Jonah tells very interesting stories. It says, Jonah says, if people repent of their sins, God will be good to them. That's the basic story of Jonah. It also shows, the book of Jonah says, non-Jews are also decent people. I mean, the Phoenicians who were sailing the boat on which Jonah tried to escape, they were very kind people, very decent people, and so were the people of Nineveh. It's a good story. It's an interesting story. It has this silly thing about Jonah and the whale, but forget that. So they read it on Yom Kippur. A rabbi came from Salonika, which was a city which had a large Spanish-speaking Jewish population. When the Jews fled Spain, they went to the Turkish Empire. They settled in Constantinople, and Izmir, and Salonika. Salonika was the great Turkish seaport in Europe, in Greece. And most of the people of Salonika, the majority population, were Jews who were Spanish-speaking. One of these rabbis came to Kandia. And he's sitting there on Yom Kippur, and somebody gets up to read the story of Jonah, and he says the blessings in Hebrew, and he starts to read the story of Jonah in Greek. So he says, what's going on here? I say, we read it in Greek. Yeah, but you're supposed to read it in Hebrew. They say, no, we've always been reading it in Greek. This is what we do. Okay, so he writes a letter to his teacher, and at that time, the city of Padua in Italy was the great Jewish center. There was a university, there was a rabbinical college, and the head of the yeshiva of Padua, the head of the school of Padua, was a German rabbi, and he was elected chief rabbi of the whole area by the Italians and the Spaniards. All of them picked him. And this rabbi was one of his students. So the rabbi writes him a letter and says, I came here and behold, they read the book of Jonah in Greek. How can they do that? So his teacher answers him, and he writes him a fascinating letter. In answering the question, he tries to refer back to the Talmud and every other source. And finally, he reaches a conclusion. He says, look, if this is the tradition of these people, don't interfere with it. He says, and if they want to read the book of Jonah in Greek, it's perfectly all right. Leave them alone. It's their tradition. Let them read it in Greek. And so we have the tradition. If you want to read a prayer in the synagogue in English, it's perfectly all right. And you could say, Rabbi Meir of Padua said it's okay. You see how the Talmud can be applied to almost any situation at any time in history, as Rabbi Moshe Feinstein did it when he gave a decision on artificial insemination. He gave a decision on the surgery on the Siamese twins and all of this. The Talmud was living Jewish law for a long time. Of course, Jews today in America and in Western Europe, and many Jews in Israel too, they don't live according to the laws of the Talmud because we have, in a way, become secularized to a large extent. But the Talmud is still a living tradition, and until the 19th century, it was the living tradition of all the Jews in the world. That is what the Talmud is. It is always the source of traditional interpretations for new conditions that arise.